Do I call this video a rematch if it never happened? Jotaro Kujo versus Diego Brando is a very interesting one, given some circumstances around Diego. Cough, cough, spoilers for future SBR episodes. This is your last warning. Jotaro Kujo is one of the strongest and fastest stand users within his original universe. On top of that, he also has the ability to dominate over time, stopping it for a near 5 seconds by the end of part 6. With Diego being no joke either with the world or scary monsters, is still a massive threat to our heroes and our main villain during his storyline within Steel Ball Run. Having the ability to have dinosaur-like abilities or having a near identical ability to stop time as well with his stand The World. Spelled differently, mind you, too. Also, not to mention the parallels, themes, and such between Jotaro versus Dio. So it makes total sense why this fight would be so popular within the fandom. Hell, it even has animations for it, which I'm basing this video off of. So in specific, this is part 6 Jotaro versus a few versions of Diego, because I'll never have the opportunity to have this fight again, so we're just gonna do it all in one go with Diego and his variants. And I would stick around for the last version of this fight, as it is by far the most interesting and probably what I think a lot of people would like to see when it comes to these two fighting. So with the premise set up, let's just jump right into it. And oh, by the way, hello, my name is Metas. While I would like to talk about Diego first, because I've never actually talked about him on my channel power scaling wise before, the problem is that I have to talk about Jotaro first, because if I don't set up his scaling beforehand, Diego's just doesn't matter. However though, unlike previous Jotaro scaling I have done on the channel, because we are talking about specifically part 6 Jotaro, things get a bit interesting. Part 6 Jotaro could either be the second strongest version of the character or the strongest version of the character, depending on how you look at things. Part 3 Jotaro starts off with some very impressive feats, making him inarguably town to city level in terms of AP and durability. Looking at the Justice feat first, we know that it's town level given the fact that Justice was able to literally copy an entire town's shape and size and inner dynamic workings thanks to Enya and her stand. Having 2 independent statements backing up that feat alone, provided from Araki himself in 2 independent interviews. One arguing that Justice is so powerful it can closely match up with the world's mental strength. And we know that mental strength within the inverse scaling of JoJo's means how strong a stand is. So your mental fortitude equates to your mental and physical strength of your stand. And given the direct correlation between Justice and the world would equate Enya being at least in the top 3 of Dio's strongest minions, maybe arguably 1 or 2. With the second interview coming from the JoJo Velar arguing that Justice, doubling down on this matter of fact as I'm saying this out loud, that she is just that strong accidentally. Funny enough, if you look at these interviews chronologically speaking, the JoJo Velar goes first, then the Jojonium statement, meaning that Araki just over time genuinely believes that Justice is just this strong. So Jotaro is already at town level, but then we get into the Sun feat. Now, of course, I've talked about this a lot on this channel, so I'll quickly run through this. Basically, the stand, the Sun, lit up the entire Sahara Desert, and depending on how you want to scale that, versus Polnareff either puts him in small town level at the minimum and at the maximum possibly being a mountain. Now, personally, going back on a lot of information that we do know about Jotaro, I think town to city level is pretty comfortable here. Why we can scale this to Jotaro is that previous to this feat, Polnareff verbatimly states that Jotaro is physically stronger than Silver Chariot and Polnareff, so it's just a Jotaro upscale. Then while fighting Dio makes all of that scaling basically concrete. Dio outperforms everybody in part 3, statement wise and feat wise, during the latter half of part 3. Then that same Dio goes awakened and arbitrarily gets stronger than any of his previous incarnations. Then gets beat by a rage boosted Jotaro with his brand new time stop ability. So when looking at Jotaro's quote unquote prime, looking at part 6 back at part 3, he's already pretty ridiculous. However, official JoJo sources coming from the JoJo Winter magazine argue that part 4 Jotaro, in terms of physical ability, is even stronger. By how much, we don't know. It's pretty arbitrary, but we just know that he's just physically stronger than his past counterpart. And no, before anybody asks, the Sword and Time Stop isn't an anti-feat. Jotaro has been fighting stand users off screen for about 10 years by that point. However, none of them have ever pressed him to use Time Stop. This just means that nobody within the universe until Kira, Josuke, Poochie, and yes, even the rat is actually indeed cracked, can push Jotaro to use time stop. So for like or Star Platinum just being the strongest stand or strongest stand with the strongest ability ever, with verbatim light speed or massively faster than light statements from these stand stat guides. Mind you though, we already had FTL scaling in part 3 in terms of speed thanks to the upscale we got from Polnareff and Silver Chariot to Jotaro and Star Platinum, thanks to the fight with Hangman and Anubis. And thanks to Star Platinum being the strongest stand, quote unquote, he does a lot of off scaling from lesser stands like his daughter and Stone Free, which have a pretty concrete town level feat against Planet Waves, who has the ability to pull down meteors from the upper atmosphere or just space in general to the ground level, this being calced around town level to city level, with Jolene and Stone Free crushing these meteors with their bare knuckles, which later on in the story is elaborated to just be her basic strength moving on forward for the ending part of part 6. However, like I said in the beginning of this video, there's a little bit of a caveat here. While you could scale part 6 Jotaro to be a town level to city level monster in terms of AP and durability being in the same range, if not greater, going off the fact that his fight against Dio kind of proves that at least Dio and Jotaro's durability are significantly higher than their AP output, part 6 also argues that by the end of the setting that is part 6 during his fight with Poochie, that physically Jotaro has been weakened somewhat, either thanks through aging or the time he was in a coma. So his physical stats might be a bit weaker. However, this is offset by the fact that Jotaro in terms of IQ and battle experience basically outbeats everybody, thanks to fighting stand users over the past 20 plus years. So you're either looking at a phenom of a monster or just a slightly weaker version of that phenomenal monster, with either version still having a 5-second time stop. So with that out of the way, now things are gonna get funny. So stick with me here, you're going to need to do that. Jotaro versus our first version of Diego, that being the one that we know that eventually becomes Scary Monsters later on in Steel Ball Run, is not a fair fight unless you think some hacks are really overpowered in this scenario. What I mean by that is this: Scary Monsters Diego Brando quite literally does not have the physical characteristics to keep up with any version of Jotaro whatsoever. Aside from endgame SBR scaling involving Love Train D4C and TUS Act 4, the best you can do in terms of AP and durability is building level, going off a feat from Gyro Zeppeli, surviving a blast from Oyo Komova in early Steel Ball Run. However, Diego might not exactly scale to that version of Gyro in specific, given the fact that Diego is never pushed that extreme. The most you could give this version of Diego is maybe Velociraptor Diego, surviving a few blows indoors during his specific intro arc with his new power. But aside that, the most you can scale this version of Diego is either like superhuman to maybe at most, if you're being really egregious and really want to compare early Gyro and early Scary Monsters Diego, to maybe being small building. But that's it. There really isn't anything past that for durability and AP. If anything, I think a good mid bowl would be like wall level at best. Now, when it comes to speed though, things are a little bit different here. If we're not using the weird endgame arguments for Steel Ball Run, funny enough, Diego is actually one of the fastest characters within Steel Ball Run, outspeeding multiple characters who are aggressively bullet timers, due in part to his Velociraptor-like abilities thanks to Scary Monsters enhancing his reaction and precision speeds, with some endgame arguments advocating for the fact that he might be relativistic, similar to Gyro by the end of Steel Ball Run, fighting FTL, Love Train, and TUS Act 4. However though, those arguments can be contentious. Now, strictly looking at stats alone, it's clearly obvious who's winning here. It's part 6 Jotaro, duh. However, though, Scary Monsters hacks might be able to close that gap ever so slightly. Now, I'm guessing a lot of you know his main ability with transforming into a Velociraptor, enhancing all of his physical abilities to a crazy high degree compared to a regular human, with the biggest boon being his speed perception. The faster an object goes, the better Diego can perceive it. However, there is a big downside to it. Slow attacks make him vulnerable because he's built around this speed perception. translation. Luckily, to get over this hindsight, Diego in later Steel Ball Run chooses to use a hybrid form of his human and dinosaur half, sacrificing his strength in return for not having that weakness. Not only that, but thanks to his transformation, he has the ability of infection and fossilization. So here's the point where things get weird. Dinosaur infection at first is a gradual effect that occurs over time, after being bitten or scratched by Diego, with the corpse parts nullifying those effects for a bit longer. However, endgame Diego can instantly transform many animals and people into dinosaurs, basically upon contact. However, he doesn't try this on people with the corpse parts, as it seems to now all of a sudden just stop the transformation just in general. That's the assumption, because Diego never does it again. He just kind of just goes for the kill, which shows his intelligence, but I'll bring that up here in a bit. So a potential one-shot ability, question mark, with fossilization just actually hardening his body or other dinosaurs' bodies for better durability. However, this ability doesn't show up a lot in Steel Ball Run, only being used periodically. So do these abilities close the gap between Scary Monsters Diego and Part 6 Jotaro? Hell no! While Scary Monsters Diego has pretty impressive hacks abilities, the reality of the situation here is he doesn't have the stats to back up those hacks to really make him a threat to Jotaro. The stat difference is just far too massive, on top of the fact that he just has way more battle experience and just a far better stand ability than Diego at the current moment. And hypothetically, just for funnies, even if I did give Diego the advantage here and say Jotaro is already on the clock as the dinosaur infection spreads throughout his entire body, does he still lose even in this scenario? And I would have to argue no. Jotaro has already been under a very short amount of time against Dio, funny enough, in their original fight. That fight only lasted canonically 5 fucking minutes, just enough time to save Joseph Joestar's life. So no, even under very, very lenient circumstances and giving Diego a pretty decent advantage here, I still don't think it would be enough for Jotaro. The only way a Diego Brando with Scary Monsters beats Jotaro Kujo is if there is an instant dinosaur infection clause with his ability within this fight. If not, yeah, no, Jotaro clears pretty easily hand over heart. However, now we come to the main fight. Parallel World Diego versus Part 6 Jotaro. Now, clarification here. Previous, I did say with normal Scary Monsters Diego that I didn't want to use endgame SBR scaling because it is a bit disingenuous, because it technically is the argument of association fallacy or no association fallacy. With the association fallacy at play, this means Parallel World Diego with the world is no better than his previous counterpart, being ever so slightly stronger, making the results of the last fight just slightly more harder for Jotaro, with him still winning it. However, with no association fallacy at play here, this fight dramatically changes. Parallel World Diego now gains the abilities and stats of Part 3 Dio, who scales off of Part 3 Jotaro. So all that scaling in the beginning of the video applies here. Because of that, this fight becomes insanely close. Both stand users here have now basically mirrored stats. The only difference is their stand experience and their battle IQs, which, mind you, are a lot similar than you would think. Diego doesn't actually fight like Dio. Diego actually uses everything in his toolkit in order to beat his opponents. Weaknesses, tactical advantages in the environment, trickery and deception, the whole thing. Diego does this constantly throughout the part against Gyro, Johnny, Hot Pants, Funny Valentine, plus so many more. By far the most famous case of this is taking the advice from Funny Valentine to beat Tuss Act 4 Johnny. Diego is an incredible fighter who doesn't have the Dio weakness of always trying to test his limits mid-fight while trying to kill his opponent, leading to a massive weakness in his defense and offense. Dio had every opportunity to kill Jotaro, however, because he prolonged it, Jotaro learned time stop and beat him. Diego has no such weakness. This also applies to Jotaro as well. As we see in Part 4 and in Part 6, Jotaro is a no-nonsense guy. He analyzes his environment, looks at his stand that he is fighting against, tries to figure out a weakness it has in comparison to the other previous stand fights he has done in order to beat his opponent. How he beats them is either just pulverizing them into oblivion in time stop or closing a gap if there is a long range with nearby weaponry, looking at the fight against Seamoon. So the question is, who wins? Well, in my humble opinion, given the fact that these two are very, very similar to each other, what I think will ultimately determine who wins here is the fact of who's been fighting stand users for longer. And of course, the obvious answer to that question is Jotaro. Jotaro has been doing this for over 20 years and knows what to do given the scenario, looking at his fight against Sheer Heart Attack, early White Snake Poochie, and Seamoon Poochie, with the biggest difference being that Jotaro has already fought somebody with time stop. ultimately defeating them with time stop because the other Dio couldn't counter time stop while frozen in frozen time. Now, while I'm giving it to Jotaro, I do have to heavily emphasize the fact that this is not going to be an easy fight for either of them. Both of them have identical stats and identical mindset when it comes to fighting, with the only difference being experience. But I would like to add here, if Diego did actually properly set up like he does against Johnny, if that's his mindset going up against Jotaro, I do think he can also win here pretty evenly as well. Furthermore, on that point, by the way, Diego's a dick. During his encounter with Tuss Act 4 Johnny, he used every advantage he could possibly have against that stand in order to put him in a scenario where he's able to counter Tuss Act 4 and throw it right back to Johnny. All that to say is this. Remember Poochie and Jolene at the end of part 6, where Jotaro had to either decide to save his daughter or kill the villain? Diego is not above that. He would do that wholeheartedly in order to beat Jotaro. And looking back on it historically, when villains have done that, Jotaro always usually goes to saving the innocent's life than protecting his own. So depending on the scenario, Diego could do some major damage here, possibly even kill Jotaro if the circumstances were correct. Choose, Jotaro, either this woman's life or your own, type shit, and then twirls his evil mustache. So for the both of them, but more in favor for Jotaro, this is going to be an extremely high difficult fight for both time-based stand users. Now mind you, it's only this close if there is no association fallacy at play. If there is, good night, Diego. Now, of course, I did promise an interesting fight here at the very end. So I present to you Part 6 Jotaro versus a no association fallacy parallel world Diego with his stands, Scary Monsters, The World. Now, I did say that Scary Monsters could be a threat if his stats backed up his hacks. But in this case, that is true if not significantly magnified because of The World. So now we're dealing with a town to city level Diego in terms of AP and durability, speed in massively faster than light plus, with the ability to slowly infect his opponents or maybe instantaneously affect his opponents with the dinosaur infection, and a 5-second time stop to boot, with maybe, depending on the scenario, a good defensive shell here or there. Any tactical advantage that Jotaro had beforehand has been completely removed from the scenario. Depending on how you want to view Scary Monster's infectious abilities, determine how this fight plays out. Either A, Jotaro potentially loses instantaneously, becoming insert any dinosaur here, or Jotaro gets hit with Scary Monsters and now the fight becomes a race to save his life. However, because of how staggeringly even it is in terms of stats, could ultimately determine that this fight could be drawn out, leading to Diego's victory. And while yes, heavily damaging Diego or even Dr. Ferdinand can delay the effects of the dinosaur infection, that would only be delaying the inevitable. So Jotaro would have to definitively kill Diego effectively almost immediately for him to win, which he does do, he tries to do, but remember, Diego is no slouch either, so easier said than done. I think this is one of the very few times where Jotaro in any versus matchup loses very uniquely to his opponent, mainly due to hacks. Time stop plus dinosaur infection is a nasty combo. All you need to do is touch them once and just burn the time out in order to secure victory. It's cheap, but Diego, of course, would do that. That is totally in character for him. Yet again, I also want to remind you on this as well. Dio and Diego are spiritually different when it comes to combat. Like I said, Dio likes to waste his time. He likes to test his abilities. He allows Jotaro to get stronger over the course of a fight, never taking the time or consideration just to instantly obliterate him given the opportunity. He always keeps messing around. Diego doesn't have that same weakness. If anything, it's the complete total opposite. He's strategic, he's brilliant, he tries to end the fight as fast as possible while also slamming you out, boosting his ego simultaneously. If you've ever wondered what Dio would look like if he wasn't screwing around in half of his fights, it would literally just be parallel world Diego with Scary Monsters, The World. Just replace the vampirism with dinosaur infection / turning into a dinosaur. But to make this as even as possible, giving Part 6 Jotaro a rage boost might close the gap just enough for him to win. However, I have to kind of speculate on that one because we do not know definitively how strong Jotaro gets during a rage boost. In Part 3, it could be pretty significant, but it's always been hard to tell. So what ultimately determines this variation of this fight in specific is hacks. And I think this is going to go in Diego's favor for the most part, unless Jotaro gets a rage boost and ends the fight as quickly as possible, which is likely. However, I think it's more likely for Diego to win rather than Jotaro getting a a rage boost and overcoming the odds. Shockingly, this is a versus matchup that is kind of close depending on the scenario. While I think Scary Monsters Diego would get obliterated, Parallel World Diego would actually serve Jotaro a pretty even fight for the most part, and giving Parallel World Diego Scary Monsters would just be enough to push him over the edge to defeat Jotaro in a hypothetical match. And that's all I think I have to say for this topic. So, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me over on Patreon if you want to consider supporting me. Stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.